Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one, we start out in the direction of Konstantinivka, where the Russians have managed to launch an offensive push towards the Ukrainian fortified positions north of the town. This has allowed them to advance along some fields, securing the area around the Dacha area, and started fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians near the town. The objective of the Russians is to gain control over the road here between Konstantinivka and Marinka. To do that, they need to capture two lines of Ukrainian fortified positions and secure the ones to the northwest of Pobeda as well. This will allow the Russians to start pushing towards Katerinivka and Antonivka, here to the west of Konstantinivka, and to completely secure the road all the way from Marinka in the north, all the way down south to Volodar in the south. In the direction of the north, the Russians have advanced further within the pocket here between Selane Pershe and Krasnorivka, which the Russians have recently captured. The Ukrainians have one remaining position here within the pocket area, and all of their supply lines are within close range of Russian artillery. That means that there is constant shelling on the Ukrainian positions here near the roads. The Russians are doing some positional fighting in the north to capture some of the fields that the Ukrainians have abandoned as they continue a slow withdrawal from the pocket to avoid getting hit as much as possible. But this slows down such a withdrawal, and the Russians slowly advance further and further. With the capture of Ukrainsk here in the west, the Russians have now secured their positions here in the southern direction, and they only lack a small part of the Ukrainian fortified positions here to the southwest of Ukrainsk, and the road between Ukrainsk and Kurakhove is practically open. There's not a lot of Ukrainian fortified positions, and the remaining fortified positions are all facing in the eastern direction. This means the Russians can move towards Sukhoryne and then along the railways, avoiding the majority of the fortified positions and moving towards the bridge north of Kurakhove. This will also cut off all of the Ukrainian positions here in the east. The Russians captured Ukrainsk, which is a major town here in the area. It is a small city, and this has freed up a lot of forces for the Russians to then push here in the direction of Hirnik, and the Battle of Hirnik has begun. This means that the Russians will continue pushing down in a southern direction all the way to the Vovcha River or the Kurokhovka Reservoir north of Kurokhovka to cut off the remaining Ukrainian forces here in the east and to reach Kurakhove from the weakest position it has, and that is to the north of it. The Ukrainians have built fortifications to the east and south of Kurakhove, expecting that the Russians would capture Volodar or somewhere of the other positions here in the south, launching operations towards the north. But instead, following the capture of Avdiivka, the Russians simply flanked it from the north, where they have not prepared proper positions, especially since the majority of these fortified positions are facing the eastern direction, as we can see here. So with this, we see that the Russians have managed to gain the most advantage possible of their push here in the direction of Pokrovsk by pushing down south, and have managed to flank the majority of the Ukrainian fortified positions, which took a long time to build, but fell fairly quickly. In the direction of Rodivka, the Russians have managed to reach the western outskirts of the town itself. It can be considered fully captured, as there's just this outskirt part that remains under Ukrainian control. Other than that, the entire town is now under Russian control. The Russians are fighting over the fortified positions surrounding Rodivka in the northern direction, and from that they'll likely push towards Mykolaiivka. The Ukrainians managed to recapture Mykolaiivka and push the Russians back across the river line. Now that the Russians have full control over Rodivka, they will soon be able to push in that direction, ignoring the limitation which is the river line, and combine it with an assault along the railways towards the western flank of Mykolaiivka, and the battle over Mirnorad will begin. We currently see that the Russians are pushing here to the northwest of Rodivka and north of Novrodivka. At the same time, they're pushing towards Lysivka and Sukhyar. The Russian objective here is to gain full control over this line of defense southeast of Pokrovsk before moving on to Mirnorad and Pokrovsk itself. At the same time, fighting continues in Selido, which has reached a stalemate since the Ukrainian reinforcements arrived. But now that the Russians have captured Ukrainsk, they'll be able to flank it from the south as well, which would expand the areas in which the Russians can attack the Ukrainians from, and also allow the Russians to use more of their firepower towards Selidova, which indicates that the Russians will likely regain the initiative within Selidova and push the Ukrainians back out of the town, which will lead to a wider front towards Pokrovsk and a stronger flank towards Kurakhova here in the north as well. Selidova is an extremely important town here in the Pokrovsk and Kurakhova section of the front line, as it connects both of the sides. There is one final highway that is directly connected between Kurakhova and Pokrovsk. However, the Russians would be able to match that by being with control of Selidova, as it will allow them to mirror the Ukrainian movement and also allow them to flank the Ukrainian defensive line here northwest of Kurakhova. Generally, we see that this area here between Pokrovsk and Kurakhova could be one of the main targets of the Russians to cut off the connection between Pokrovsk and Kurakhova, and generally to attempt to gain control over the line of defense that is connected both here to the south by Andreevka, the fortified position here in the center, and to completely cut off the connection between Pokrovsk and the southern section of the front line. This would be connected with a Russian assault and offensive here in the south near Volodar, as it will allow the Russians to gain a significant advantage in terms of supplies, as the Ukrainians would be limited in this direction, and a general offensive towards Andreevka to gain control over that will allow the Russians to flank the Ukrainian positions all throughout this section of the front line. Further north in the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have advanced both in the central parts, reaching the outskirts of the high-rise apartment complex area, as well as the industrial zone here in the central parts of Toretsk. At the same time, they've fully secured the apartment complex area in the eastern parts. This means that the Russians will continue offensive operations here in the central parts of Toretsk, relocating the majority of their forces to this central parts as they continue to attempt to connect the southern flank with the central flank and cut off the Ukrainian positions in the east. But generally, the situation in Toretsk is also very difficult, as the Russians have now reached the hearts of the Ukrainian defenses in the city. And the north and the southern flank of Bakhmut, the Russians have captured the remaining parts of the area here east of the canal in the south of Ivanivske, leaving this small area west of Andreevka and northwest of Kordyomivka remaining under Ukrainian control, which they will likely withdraw from now that the Russians have gained control of the remaining parts of the canal. This would mean that the Russians would have full control over the eastern parts of the canal, all the way from Orlivka and through to Hrihorivka. In the Kremen-Kupiansk section of the front line, we see that the Russians have managed to gain further control over the area northeast of Selmahivka and southwest of Pishane, where the Russians continue offensive operations to gain full control over Selmahivka and the Serbis River line here in the north, and to push towards the Uska River line. We may see the start of battles over Kostinikivka and Kruhlyakivka here in the near future to cut off the connection between Kupiansk and Borova in the south. In the Kursk section of the front line, the Russians have advanced further, securing Spalnoe, and are moving slowly towards Plekhovo, where the objective is to gain control over the river line here in the east, free up some forces, and start a push towards Sutsha from the northeast. At the same time, the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations to flank the Russian counteroffensive in the direction of Lyubimovka. Here they are pushing in the direction of Volfino and Veseloe. Here we see that the Ukrainians continue their offensive operations in an attempt to flank the Russian forces, but they are so far not succeeding. For example, we have this image of 3 armored vehicles burned near a field here in the Kursk region. The Russians were prepared for such an attempt by the Ukrainians, and heavy firepower landed on the Ukrainians as soon as their attempts began, and the Ukrainians continued attempting to push and flank the Russian forces by pushing in the direction of Glushkovo. However, so far they are failing completely, not gaining control over any significant territory, nor flanking the Russian supply lines. They are only redirecting firepower, which would slow down the Russian offensive operations, which could be why they have yet to capture Lyubimovka and General River line here in the east, as the Russians had to redirect some forces and firepower to deal with such an operation. However, with no withdrawal announced here in the Kursk direction, it is meaningless to simply slow them down and use up some forces that they otherwise could have used to deal with the offensive operations head on, or to simply clear out a withdrawal for the Ukrainian soldiers. because we can see clearly if the Russians are allowed to continue their offensive operations, they will eventually reach the rear, and the Ukrainians would be forced to do a quick withdrawal, which would be chaotic, or that they would be cut off completely from supplies, which would be even worse. Generally, what the Ukrainians are currently doing is not enough to deal with the Russian Kursk counteroffensive. They will lose this battle if it continues as is, and therefore the Ukrainians need to do something else. Otherwise, they are just running down a path to destruction. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching.